Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today as part of Fleet Management Awareness Month. Before we get into the official presentation, I have a few housekeeping items to go through. First of all, you'll notice that there is a poll question on your screen. This will let us know who we're talking to today. If you could take just a moment and respond to the poll, we'll come back to the responses shortly. Second, I do want to make everyone aware that we are recording this presentation today, so please keep in mind that questions asked out loud may be part of that recording that will be posted on NPMA's YouTube channel following this presentation. We will be saving the questions for the end unless there's something urgent that needs to be responded to throughout the presentation, and there are two ways that you can ask questions. The first way is to ask your question out loud. If you would like to do this, please make sure that if you are using your phone, you have entered in your audio pin so that I can unmute you. And second, when you have a question that you would like to ask out loud, please click on the hand icon next to your name in the GoToWebinar panel. That'll notify me that you have a question and I'll be able to unmute you at an appropriate time. That is a sensitive button, so just be aware of that. Sometimes we can accidentally press the button and not realize that we're trying to ask a question, so just keep an eye on that button. The second option for asking a question is to keep it anonymous, and if you'd like to do that, there's a questions box. You can type your question into that panel, and then at the end of the presentation, I will ask the question on your behalf, but I will not announce your name, so we can keep that anonymous. So those are your two options for questions. Next, if you are attending in a conference room as part of a group today, please be sure and send me a chat message or an email with any other participants that are in the room with you that may not be the one that logged into the webinar. If you are an NPMA member, we will be giving you 1 CEU credit for participating today, so I want to make sure everyone gets credit for that participation. And finally, we will have 2 winners of Amazon gift cards for participating today. It'll be a random drawing later this afternoon that I will do, and I will notify you by email if you are one of our winners. So it looks like most of you have responded to the poll, so I'm going to go ahead and close that out so we can take a look at the results. Okay, fantastic. So we've got a good mix here. So 21% of you are responsible for fleet, 46% are responsible for asset and property management, 28% both, and 4% neither. So that's fantastic. Thank you for letting us know a little bit more about you. I'm going to hide this poll now, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to our guest presenters today, Mr. William Gookin and Mike Showers. Willie, you may take it from here.
All right, thank you very much, Jessica. And folks, welcome to Property Management versus Fleet Management. I know this is a very popular briefing, but good afternoon. My name is William Gookin, along with my co-presenter, Mike Showers. And during the next hour, we will be discussing property management as it relates to fleet management. Michael, you can take it from here.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody, for listening in. Good afternoon. As many of you know, there are several legal and regulatory authorities related to the management of government property. Most important of these is the 40 U.S.C., commonly referred to as the Property Act. Been out there since 1945, going on quite a long time. 1949, excuse me. The Act gives General Services Administration the authority to develop regulatory guidance for federal agencies over certain aspects of the property management process. Historically, that guidance was fairly comprehensive. When it was the Federal Property Management Regulation, it covered a whole wide range of topics. It had all kinds of things in there like planning for acquisition, maintenance and utilization standards, all the way through to disposition. There were detailed requirements for situations like replacement versus repair. It used to give you several algorithms to determine when the right time was to repair and when the right time was to replace. They had use standards for things like typewriters and even file cabinets, so you know they were around for quite a long time. And the last but not least, in the very lexicon of this, there were lease versus purchase determinations. there were a lot of things having to do with the management of property, not necessarily just the disposal of property. And many of these requirements didn't make it into the current regulation. The current regulation is in the Federal Management Regulation, as you may know, and associated bulletins. It's somewhat more limited. It primarily concerns itself with disposition of personal property, and agencies are actually expected to develop their guidance for the other property management and what we call in the FAR world outcomes. Beyond that, the FMR Bulletin B18 recommends supplementing the FMR, and agency guidance using voluntary consensus standards. And you can see in the slide, obviously, we have several of the voluntary consensus standards that we are associated with in NPMA in one way or another. And they do help us to fill in some of the blanks in the management arenas that were not there. Of course, if you're in the corporate side of the house, you're looking at the requirements of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which does take you a little further down the road and asks for outcomes for pretty much the entire property management life cycle. And as outcomes are what's asked for, and government asks contractors to use their own property systems, generally the how to accomplish things are left up to the contractor, and the use of standards again is promoted. Can we switch slides? Primarily, the responsibility under the Property Act for the management sections, or the management outcomes, for lack of a better term, in the property world, falls on the federal agencies. 40 U.S.C. 483B states that each executive agency shall maintain adequate inventory controls and accountability standards, or accountability systems, for property under its control. It goes on and it adds some things having to do with disposal of property after that. Then in 40 U.S.C. section 121B2, it requires the administrator of GSA to work with the Comp General and executive agencies to develop accounting systems. It's an interesting word, accounting systems for federal property. And the term system includes IT components and non-automated processes used to account for federal property. You can see that the emphasis falls on accountability and control more than any of the other aspects, record keeping, rather than some of the other management aspects of property management that we know of today. Go ahead. Next slide, please. This is the outcomes of property that are outcomes for property management that are taken pretty much from the FAR. As many of you who are contractors will recognize these very well. As I was saying a few minutes ago, the Federal Property Administrative Services Act is what it used to be called, the Property Act, 40 U.S.C., talks a lot about recording, it talks a lot about reporting, and it talks about physical inventory of property, but it doesn't give too much information, and disposition, of course, but it doesn't give too much information on all of these other outcomes. And excuse me, I have to move down in my notes. When you combine the audit requirements of the CFO Act with all of these things that are put out there, you see a significant emphasis being placed on the accountability and inventory control sections of property. And with limited available resources for property management, other recognized management outcomes often move to the back burner. And with organizational constraints and budgetary control usually residing in programs rather than in the property office, they move completely off the back burner and sometimes completely off the stove. So it's important for us to recognize that management of property on the federal internal side of the house is much more than just accounting for property. It also has to do with these other outcomes that you see in the FAR and in most of the property related documentation and training. Go ahead and move to the next slide, please. What you measure is what you get. Most measurements for government personal property seem to be tied to the success of a record keeping system and record keeping processes. They're limited generally to loss findings and results of physical inventories. what needed to be changed because the items moved, the location changed, the user changed, overages and shortages, things like that tend to drive the accountability side of the house. One of the problems with this is that the limited reporting is particularly focuses on losses. And that's, as I say here, fish in a barrel for sensational reporting. I recently have read through several GAO reports going all the way back to 1974. There was a report for on the Coast Guard on how their accountability systems weren't keeping up with what was expected at that time, and I'm sure was manually done at that time. I was personally involved in a 2007 GAO report at NASA about our property systems, and GAO has even done something as recently as March of this year with GAO being criticized for a lack of controls and accountability and proper use of their accountability systems. So it happens out there, and then I can tell you from experience that these reports often turn into the fodder of Washington Post articles and so forth, becoming quite embarrassing to the agencies that are responsible. But as you can see, there's little discussion in there of all of the positive aspects of property management having to do with adequate utilization, proper maintenance and repair, and so forth. And I think that's because what is available to review are simply the records associated with loss and existence and completeness that we associate nowadays with more of the financial side of the house than anything else. Go ahead. I was taught in a number of years ago in one of my college courses that successful management is making the best use of available resources in pursuit of an agency's goals. And I think some of the things that we can learn from our contractors, some of the same things we can learn from our contractors, property managers, they're required by FAR to do far more and achieve many more of the outcomes in property than we normally have to do internally within the government property office. They have to answer questions such as, are their maintenance programs effective in terms of equipment availability and cost? Are they making the best use of storage space and resources by limiting retention of unused items? Are they fully utilizing our property, or is much of it sitting idle in storage without planned further future use? Or are awaiting possible reuse through the disposition process? Are things being ordered are what is needed, or is things being ordered what people want? These kind of questions can go unanswered if they're not somehow managed within the system. Excuse me. Many of the definitions of management that you see in dictionary.com and other sources have to deal with the people. In other words, these are managers. This is what a management is, managers. And while that's correct, I think the functional definition that I gave a few minutes ago is a far better definition because it deals with the outcome of management. It emphasizes that management is a goal as much as it is the people who are achieving that goal. And I think that we need to think overall that management isn't just keeping track of where things are, but it involves far more than that. And to that end, when we simply concentrate our efforts on accountability, we're contributing, but we're not fully managing property. In a response to a number of new laws, and in particular executive orders, the fleet community is moving to incorporate additional property management outcomes into their work. Willie is going to speak to the legal requirements that stimulated that activity and how our fleet brethren are moving forward to implement them. In the property community, I think we should think about how some of the fleet innovations can be spread to other types of property and perhaps even to real property. Okay, Willie, turning it over to you.
All right, thank you, Michael. As Mike mentioned earlier, government-owned and leased motor vehicles are accountable personal property. And, oh, by the way, they must be accounted for and captured and your accountable property system of record. And I know that a lot of folks are struggling with that. In fact, many times when we go out and we look at an inventory, they have lots of vehicles that are not described correctly. Perhaps they've got vehicles that have been disposed of still in the inventory, or they've got vehicles they're driving around that's just ghosts. They're not even in inventory at all. The reporting metrics do differ, which means the fleet manager not only has to ensure vehicles are accounted for in the proper system, but that they are also available to meet the mission requirements. And Mike touched on that briefly. The fleet manager is also required to track multiple metrics to ensure the fleet is managed efficiently and effectively, while at the same time meeting federal and state laws and organizational requirements and mandates. One of the many federal laws that the fleet manager must be aware of is the Energy Policy Act, which requires them to monitor and only acquire alternative fuel or low greenhouse gas emitting vehicles. That is, unless none of these vehicles are available that will meet the mission requirements. Executive Order 13603, signed by President Obama in March of 2015, requires federal fleets to comply with the following, and you can see here on the slide: determine an optimal fleet inventory or vehicle allocation methodology, eliminate those non-essential vehicles. In other words, those vehicles that you have sitting around just in case another one breaks down. Reduce the fleet-wide mile per gallon greenhouse gas emissions based upon a 2014 baseline, and then hit specific targets, of course, for 17, which is last year, and now 21 and 25. And a lot of the agencies are struggling with this, where some others are doing very well. Acquire and deploy vehicle telematics no later than 2 years from the date of the executive order. One of the things with that is, if you read the fine print in the implementation instructions, it's where it makes sense. And so, in other words, departments and agencies have to say, is it smart cents, is it dollar cents? Are we going to get a return for the American taxpayer by putting it on these vehicles, and then make that determination? But they have to document it. Collect and apply agency fleet operational data, et cetera, through the telematics. And of course, that's all has to do with the vehicle level data or asset level data that has to be entered into Federal Automobile Statistical Tool. And of course, ensure vehicle specific data is accurately accounted for in the FMIS, and ensure that it's accurately accounted for in the Federal Automobile Statistical Tool, or FAST, and Fleet Sustainability Dashboard, Fleet Dash. You can see the fleet managers have a tremendous amount they have to do. And for those that don't know, the federal fleet has approximately 600,000 plus vehicles, and is currently valued at approximately $4 billion a year. And I think with the asset level data that's going to be collected, and it's going to be further refined as the years go on, you'll see that probably jump up by 30 or 40%. And this is Executive Order 13693 as we're continuing. And of course, it's another requirement of the Executive Order is for the fleet managers to plan for their fleet composition. As you can see on this slide, there's a requirement for 50% of the department or agency fleet to be zero emission by 2025. Plus, fleet manager must work with the comptroller and facility folks to plan for charging and fueling infrastructure to support these vehicles. Like other types of personal property, there are several fleet management regulations and codes of federal regulations that provide minimum accounting and reporting requirements for fleet assets. In order for the fleet manager to adequately manage the fleet, they need to have a solid fleet management information system that has the capability to capture fleet data and to meet the new vehicle level data requirements. Oftentimes, departments and agencies attempt to modify their property systems to meet these requirements. Not only is this costly, but unlike the state-of-the-art FMISs or fleet management information systems, the legacy property system will not likely be updated to keep up with the ever-changing fleet requirements. And I know that a lot of folks are struggling with this across multiple departments and agencies. But this is something that needs to be really looked at, and looked at hard, because again, with the vehicle level data that has to be reported on each individual vehicle within that fleet, you need a tool that can enable that to happen. Data captured in the FMIS must be used for decision making to ensure the fleet is operated in the most reliable and efficient manner. The fleet manager must be able to determine what the optimal fleet makeup is and what size it is to meet the mission requirements. They must also know what their total cost of ownership is for their own fleet and when it's the best time to replace that vehicle for fleet renewal, and whether during fleet renewal it is better to lease that vehicle from GSA or to continue owning it. And that's commonly referred to as a lease versus buy analysis. And this is where those folks who have owned vehicles within their fleet, in other words, the department or agency is out and out buying these vehicles, need to make a determination each time that vehicle is replaced, whether or not it's most advantageous to the American taxpayer and to that department to either lease that vehicle from GSA or to continue purchasing it and owning it. The Department of Energy's Federal Energy Management Program, for our FEMP, has issued guidance to headquarters and fleet managers to assist with petroleum reduction strategies and to monitor overall performance of the agency fleet petroleum use and greenhouse gas reductions. And a little bit ago, I talked about the greenhouse gas reductions and where it's being measured, and it is the FEMP part of DOE who helped the agencies and departments come up with that 2014 baseline or the target that they have now to track their reductions. And very similar to FEMP guidance to the headquarters fleet manager, FEMP has also issued guidance for the installation level fleet manager. And as you can see on this slide here, there's a lot that rolls all the way down from the agency or department level fleet manager that has to go down to where the rubber meets the road. And these guys and gals out there who are managing the fleet need to stay on top of it. And more importantly is ensure the fleet locations is in compliance with all the applicable fleet requirements. And it's not just the federal laws or the CFRs or the FMRs, it's also the state laws. Every one of these folks who have these organizational assets within the states, they have to follow by the state law as well. Just because you're a federal fleet doesn't mean that you don't have to comply. And there's differing priorities between the headquarters and the field. Of course, you know, the headquarters, because they're up here in the Washington, D.C. area typically, they're very interested. They want to comply with the EPAC, with the executive orders. They want to look at the agency scorecards, the DOE scorecards. They want to be able to go into their senior leadership and talk about how they've reduced their fleet or maybe right-sized certain vehicles, say a Ford 350 truck down to a 150 perhaps. They want to be able to boast of the alternative fuels that they're using. And when it comes to the Federal Automotive Statistical Tool, and that's what FAST stands for, they're the ones that have to review what the field submits and make sure it's accurate and accurately represents the inventory. And one of the most challenging parts of the headquarters is dealing with the home to work. Who has authorization and who does not have authorization to take a government vehicle home and then commute back into the work or to another work location with it. And of course, writing of the policies and ensuring that laws and regulations are followed. In the field, it's a different ballpark. They have a lot they have to do, but mainly what they're concerned with out there is keeping those drivers happy. What they don't want is folks complaining to their leadership and then it coming down to them that they're not fully supporting them. They also have to ensure that vehicles are safe and that they're running, that they have operational vehicles that folks want to take out and they want to get the work done. They got to determine, do they have the money or the budget to get new vehicles? Are we going to acquire that vehicle from GSA Fleet Lease, or are we going to own that vehicle? That's the determination that's typically made in the field and then rolls up to the headquarters. There's requirements versus desirements. What we mean on that is, what type of vehicle do you need that's required to meet your mission, not what you want. So often what we see is folks out here who are ordering vehicles because maybe a senior leader within the organization says, excuse me, I really want leather seats. Well, the leather seat is a desirement. And oh, by the way, you should not be ordering that type of stuff if you're getting a government vehicle. The field has to monitor the accidents. They got to monitor the vendor, especially if they're doing upfitting on the vehicle, for instance, taking a sedan and maybe putting lights and sirens into it, or perhaps if you're working in a USDA element, you may have a soil sample truck that has to have an auger attached. The field has to monitor the tags. They have to be very cognizant of the Federal Management Vehicle Registration System and how it works. They got to monitor the fuel. They got to make sure that not only is the proper fuel being put into that vehicle, but if alternative fuels are available, they have to make sure if the vehicle is a flex fuel type or one of the others, that they're putting the appropriate fuel in there 100% of the time. And not last but not least, but more importantly, is the Federal Automotive Statistical Tool. That's a tool that opens up in October. It's a data set, and it closes usually around mid-December. And that's where every bit of the data for each individual vehicle at the individual level is entered into a system, and then it rolls up to the department or headquarter level, and senior leadership can actually drill down and take a look at vehicle by vehicle, see how it's being used, how many hours, how many miles, what type of fuel is going into it, and things of that sort. In other words, total cost of operations. They track the data in disparate programs, and oftentimes it's another job just assigned. They wear multiple hats in the field, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, but that really creates a problem. Of course, unlike property managers, most fleet managers have had little or no formal training on how to manage their fleet. That is, until the National Property Management Association, in conjunction with Mercury Associates, developed the Federal Fleet Management Certification Program. The bottom line, folks, most senior managers do not realize that their fleet managers are often managing a multi-million-dollar program. They have no idea of the level of complexity or the federal, state, and state laws, mandates, and other requirements that the fleet manager must be cognizant of in order to effectively manage the fleet. And to top it off, because fleet gets little, if any, visibility, that is, unless something goes wrong, oftentimes management sees no need for the fleet manager to be more than just a part-time duty. And folks, that is a big mistake. Many times we've seen at various levels, installation levels or departments, where a person maybe has made a senior manager very angry. And so what do? They take them from a $1 million program and they slide them over to a multi-million-dollar fleet program as a penalty, not realizing what the dollar value of the new program they're going to have to manage is. And oh, by the way, they have no idea what they should be doing because they've never been in the fleet arena. To further complicate the situation, management of agency-owned vehicles may be managed by an entirely different person or office that manages the GSA fleet lease vehicles. Remember earlier I talked about there's two types of vehicles. You have, actually there's three, but more predominantly you have GSA fleet leased, and then you have the owned fleet by the department. The third would be the commercially leased, which there's not very many of those out there. Or if there's an in-house repair shop, the fleet manager may not be aware of the maintenance management system or even how they use it. Many field units have what they call equipment managers, and equipment managers usually manage assets that are not considered Federal Automotive Statistical Tool or FAST reportable, such as forklifts, cranes, bulldozers, tractors, etc., otherwise known as yellow iron. Because some of these organizations have separated the duties of the fleet manager versus equipment managers, synergies have been lost in the overall support for the yellow iron due to differing reporting requirements. And an example, fast reportable fleet assets have a very high visibility, whereas yellow iron does not. And, excuse me. I think that most of you are aware that with yellow iron, it is managed, it goes in the shops, it gets repaired, we know what the maintenance records are on it, but one of the things that's not being done is having a total visibility. Oftentimes you'll see several organizations in one installation. They all have a D9 Caterpillar, but none of them are being used more than 20% of the time. Why aren't those things consolidated? Why are we not sharing assets? I'm not saying this happens all the time, but we see it quite often. This slide is to give you an idea of some, but not all of the responsibilities of a fleet manager. As you can see, to be effective, the fleet manager must be able to have full visibility and operational knowledge of the fleet from the time the vehicles are procured until they're disposed of. And just looking at this wagon wheel here of different responsibilities, and one of the things that's not in there is the politics piece of it. So often fleet managers, because folks get very emotional when they're talking about their vehicles and their desires or their desirements or requirements, the fleet manager is kind of the sounding board. That's where the buck stops, is with them. And they have to make sure that the vehicles are there to meet the mission requirements, not what somebody would just like to have. The difference between fleet management and traditional property management is the daily operations step and the FMIS. You can see it right there in red. This is where, as shown on the previous slide, the rubber meets the road. So in other words, everything that happens within the traditional property manager's responsible area or area of responsibility, the fleet manager has all that, plus everything that we talked about earlier on the other slides. And oh, by the way, in order to manage and do things effectively and efficiently, they have to have a fleet management information system. There is no way you can manage a fleet without a state-of-the-art FMIS. These are just some of the fleet challenges that many organizations are facing. And even in this day and time where there's asset level or vehicle level data as a requirement, some folks do not have a good fleet management information system in place. I talked a little bit earlier about poor inventory data on owned assets. Again, there's lots of times on the inventory, it shows vehicles that are in the inventory when they've been disposed of, sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. There's vehicles that have been acquired during that period of time that was never loaded into the inventory. What many departments, agencies, field units don't have, they don't have good utilization data on the owned asset. They can tell you that somebody is checking the vehicle out, but they have no idea what it's being used for, how much cargo it's being carried, how many passengers are being carried, or exactly what the vehicle's being occupied for or used and what the line of work. Lack of policy and standard operating procedures across large organizations with geographically dispersed operations. Many times at a department level or an agency, they don't have a centralized management of the fleet. What they may have is 3 or 4 high-level type folks who are maybe involved in fleet. They don't talk to each other. You have multiple installations worldwide, perhaps, and they're all out there kind of doing their own thing because they don't have standardized operating procedures, and they don't have a single person within a department or agency that manages all these vehicles. Oftentimes, another big issue here with the fleet is users think the vehicle belongs to them. And I can tell you that a lot of times in the heavier equipment, such as tractors and trailers and things like that, the semis, a lot of drivers I have seen, they will show up to the motor pool, find out that their rig has been checked out to another driver, and actually go on sick leave because they're not going to drive another truck because their truck is no longer available. There's inadequate training of the field fleet staff, and we touched on that a little bit ago when we talked about the Federal Fleet Certification Program. Folks, there's too many laws and regulatory requirements that can be broken and are punishable if the fleet manager does not do their job correctly. And that's why they need to be fully informed. They need to know exactly what it is they're doing and what it is they should be doing. And of course, there's a gap between headquarter policy and field operations. And oftentimes there's a policy that's written within the headquarters, but is no implementation policy or no standard operating procedure for the field units to deploy or adhere to that policy. And then there's nobody from the headquarters who's going out and policing, making sure the policy is being adhered to. The future of fleet summary here. This just kind of gives you an idea how the fleet inventory changes over time. And accounting for the property is still a requirement. I'm not going to say which department it is, but they have a 1929 truck that has been around with their inventory for years, and they now use it in parades and things like that. So you can see we got a 1919 Ford, then we get to a 57 Thunderbird, and a 2018 Ford Focus. This is just an example of some of the new requirements that the fleet managers have, and this has to do with electric vehicles. As you've seen on the previous slide, by a certain period in time, they got to have half their fleet zero emission, in other words, electric. And so what they have to do is they're going to have to work with facility people, they're going to have to work with the comptroller shop, and they've got to get this infrastructure for the plug-in ability on these vehicles through charging. And another reason I put some stats here for you is to let you know how these vehicles have advanced. It's amazing that miles per gallon city, 118, that's miles per gallon equivalent, 96 on the highway. Battery charge time, if you're at home and you plug it in, basically full charge, 110 volts, 20 hours. If you got a 220 volt outlet, which you can also do in your home, 3.5 hours. And if you have one of the higher end ones, 440 volt, you're looking only at a half hour to charge this vehicle. And it's amazing, it even has a horsepower of 143. And of course, a lot of folks are familiar with Teslas and things like that. And so they also have their own stats, but this just gives you an idea of some of the complexities that the fleet manager is dealing with. Okay, I mentioned a little bit ago about the Federal Fleet Certification Program that the NPMA offers, very similar to the property certification programs. There is now a CFFS, CFFA, and a CFFM. And just to give you an idea of what it is, a specialist is defined as someone who works to support fleet activities, often part-time, such as a vehicle control officer or fleet point of contact in an office, and is often involved in day-to-day field operations. Whereas the administrator, or the A level, is defined as someone who manages a small to mid-sized fleet program at a headquarters or region bound an installation or a campus location. And give an example of a campus location, maybe say at NASA at the Greenbelt site. That's a campus location. It's kind of contained within the fence. Granted, they do have vehicles that go out and they do over-the-road trucking and stuff like that, take satellites down to Kennedy Space Center or wherever. But that's just an example of what we'd consider a campus or an installation. And then, of course, for the manager is defined as someone who manages a mid-sized to a large fleet program and has policy, planning, and reporting and acquisition oversight responsibilities, along with a leadership role. And this isn't all the time at a headquarter element. Many of the other departments and agencies, you get in the Forest Service, Park Service, folks like that. You have folks who are out at the field who are performing or working at that level, at the manager level. And as you can see here, the minimum of experience for the S level, basically anybody can sign up for it. In order to go into the A, you have to be able to demonstrate that you have at least 1 year of experience. And at the manager level, you have to be able to demonstrate you have 3 years of experience. And something that's really important here, if you have not already saved the date, the National Property Management Association in 2018 will have their National Education Seminar. This is August 6th through 9th. It's going to be held in Chicago. It's very important that you sign up for this if you can. This is not a conference. It is a seminar, and it's oftentimes it's blessed by OPM as such. And also here on the bottom here, you see a fleet special interest group. We encourage you to sign up for it. It costs nothing, but it's a way for you to connect with other fleet professionals and property professionals across the federal government, contractor space. Some state and local governments are also in it, so that you can get some of your questions answered. Okay, and then of course there's innovation. There is a fleet award that's given annually at the NES, which recognizes new or innovative fleet management practices. All right, now we'll do any questions. This here concludes our presentation.
Thanks, Willie, and thanks, Mike. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in at this time, and I'll ask them for you anonymously, or click on the hand icon and I can unmute you so that you can ask a question out loud. We do have one question, Willie, from someone that has typed a question in. The question is, I have not experienced the rationale for assigning someone as a fleet manager as punishment. Do you have any statistics on this or examples to share regarding this example?
Well, I can give an example of it that we have seen. I won't go which department or agency it is, but at a department level, they had a program manager that was not performing at the level they should, had nothing to do with fleet. There happened to be a fleet opening, and they assigned that person in there. And it's kind of like, you know, you're not a bartender, but now you are. Same thing with the fleet. They had no idea what they should be doing. Fortunately, the person was sharp enough that after a period of time, they started picking up on it, and they did survive. But it doesn't happen all that often, but it has happened. And I would say annually within the federal space, my experience with field level units and things, it probably happens 2 or 3 times a year.
Thanks, Willie. Next question. Just curious about lost fleet. What issues arise when part of a fleet is missing?
Oh my goodness gracious. Excellent question. We just finished up working with a department, and during the vehicle allocation methodology, they found that they were missing 3 vehicles at this one location. Of course, it's a campus type location, so they ended up having to survey these vehicles and claim them as lost, and of course that caused additional investigations. But you cannot just take them off the inventory if you don't know what happened to them. There are property research and reporting that has to go. Remember, these are our personal property. And Mike, if you're still online,
I'm here.
What would you say on that?
Yeah, most agencies that I've been associated with in the past have had a board of survey or report of survey process that would require, whether it be a vehicle, a computer, or even sometimes large quantities of stock out of a warehouse, to be reported through the report of survey process, which is usually results in an administrative hearing to determine whether there's approximate cause for the loss, might be associated with some malfeasance or lack of effort on behalf of the individual who's responsible for it, or some other individual, or it may just be found to be a record-keeping error. In some cases, that's the case as well. In fact, a lot of cases, we have record-keeping errors as the response, not the responsible is not the word I look, but as the proximate cause for not knowing where something is. But the board of survey process is pretty common across the government to determine what happened. Of course, from the contractor side of the house, you have loss reporting required under the FAR, and that would also fall within determination by the contracting officer whether the contractor should be held responsible for a loss of government property.
And I will tell you, folks, of course, that survey process, it can be very long, lengthy. It has to be done. Usually it's done by 2 or 3 people, not a single individual. But, another instance with vehicles, especially when vehicles are being purchased, held perhaps for a particular program, and so they may be in a warehouse, they may be in a lot. There has been instances where people have actually stolen those vehicles. and they didn't even know they were gone until such time as they went to fulfill the requirement to that particular program. So it does happen. It's not all that common, but it does happen.
Well, actually, it is kind of common in the property world that things that are in storage and not a whole lot of attention is being paid to them. Those are the things that tend to get lost most commonly. Also,
Right.
you might want to consider that it's not just loss in terms of not being able to find the vehicle, but loss in terms of damage, accident damage even may be investigated by a reported survey.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael.
The next question is actually regarding the Fed fleet that's coming up later this month. Do either of you know if OPM deemed this as a seminar or is it considered a conference?
That I don't know. The Fed fleet is put on by the GSA side of the house. If Connie Aaron is online, she's with OGP. She could probably type in a response, but I cannot answer that one.
I don't have Connie in today.
Or Patrick McConnell, is he online?
Nope. But I tell you what, I will send a note to Connie, and I will follow up with the individual that asked this question following.
Oh, that would be great.
Yep. All right. I believe we're all clear. Go ahead, Mike.
Might be a good idea to post an answer in the SIG where everybody has access to it.
That is a good idea. Thank you. I'll do that.
Okay. What I would like to say is, thank everybody for participating in this. I know that the property versus fleet is a very hot topic with a lot of interest on it. And with Mike and I, both of us have worked in both property and fleet arenas in our past. And I will tell you that oftentimes a fleet manager works for the property manager, but the property manager says, as long as I don't hear nothing bad coming out, you just do what you want to do. And so what I would offer is property managers, senior property managers need to become more involved in the fleet, know what the regulatory requirements are, know what the statute or the United States Code requirements are, and understand that there's a lot of things that happen in the fleet that you can get in a lot of trouble for. So,
well, again, to my point as well, there's a lot of good things coming out of that in terms of actual management of property. Fleet managers are, as you can see by all the requirements there, actually required in many cases to make management level decisions as opposed to just where is the property, can we put our hands on it right now, and did it show up during the last physical inventory. I think that it's important for us to take a look at what's going on in fleet, because I think we should be looking all the way down the line in all of our property arenas at what the fleet folks are doing.
Okay, if there's no other questions, I appreciate you taking time out of your day to attend this webinar. And if you have any additional questions and you'd like to point them straight at Mike or I, you can see our contact information on the screen. Please call us or email us, and we'd be glad to discuss it with you.
Sure will.
Thanks, everyone.